years ago this month, the official UK Top 20, 18th April, 1976, presented by Simon Jones. Hello, and welcome to something a little different, and, I suspect, something we may be doing again. This is 50 years ago this month, a nostalgic look back at the official UK singles chart from exactly half a century ago. I'm Simon Jones, and today we're traveling back to 18th April, 1976. To find out what Britain was buying, humming, dancing to, and quite possibly snogging awkwardly to in the spring of that year. And I have to say, what a chart. Because this wasn't just a random week. This was a proper snapshot of 1970s Britain in musical form. There's pop, there's disco, there's soul, there's rock, there's Cliff, there's ABBA, there's Barry White, and perhaps most importantly, there is absolutely no sign yet of the Dung Beatles, though give history time. So let's take a look at the official UK Top 20 from 18 April 1976. And yes, we're going to do this properly, in reverse. Because if you're going to revisit a chart, you may as well enjoy the climb. At number 20, Pluto Shervington with Dat, which is exactly the sort of slightly left-field chart presence that gives these old Top 20s their extra charm. Because a chart should always contain at least one record that makes you say, oh yes, I'd forgotten that was there, and that one definitely qualifies. At 19, Yvonne Fair with It Should Have Been Me, a proper soul record with real bite to it. The sort of song that reminds you just how much emotional force some of these records had. At 18, The Beatles with Yesterday, and already, we've reached a point where one of the most famous songs ever written is sitting at number 18. Which tells you two things. Firstly, how enormous the Beatles were, and secondly, how wonderfully strange old charts can be. At 17, Elton John with Pinball Wizard, which is Elton doing Elton things. Confident, theatrical, and absolutely at home in a chart like this. At 16, Status Quo with Rain, pub rock reliability in chart form. The Quo always had that ability to sound as if they'd simply wandered into the top 20 by instinct and stayed there out of habit. At 15, CW. McCall with Convoy. Now this is exactly why revisiting old charts is such fun. Because every so often, sitting among the soul, pop, and disco, you find something completely different. And there it is, a trucking anthem. At number 15, As Normal As You Like. A Simpler Age. At 14, Brass Construction with Movin', a proper groove record. And one of those songs that reminds you how much funk and dance influence was already bubbling through the charts by the mid-70s. At 13, The Beatles with Billy Preston with Get Back. Which means that by number 13, the Beatles have already appeared twice in the same top 20. And that is the sort of thing that reminds you just how unusual they were. By 1976, they were already part of history, and still somehow part of the current conversation. That doesn't. At 12, Silver Convention with Get Up and Boogie, which sounds exactly like what it is, an instruction, no ambiguity, no poetry, no hidden layers, just get up. And indeed, boogie. And sometimes, frankly, that is enough. At 11, just outside the top 10, Cliff Richard with Miss You Nights. And Cliff, of course, is one of those constants in British pop history, like tea, or drizzle. Or people saying, wasn't it better in the old days? While standing in a queue. But Miss You Nights is genuinely lovely, warm, wistful, and quietly emotional. A proper ballad. And now we move into the top 10. At 10, Fox with SSS Single Bed. Now there's a title. And a wonderfully 1970s one at that. A little cheeky. A little stylish. A little ooh, steady on. Exactly the kind of thing Britain has always secretly rather enjoyed. At 9, the Bay City Rollers with Love Me Like I Love You. And if you were around at the time, you probably didn't need to be told they were in the chart. You would have heard the screaming from several counties away. The Rollers were not merely a band. They were a social event, and their presence here is a lovely reminder that pop hysteria existed long before the internet discovered caps lock. At 8, Tina Charles with I Love to Love, and this is where you can hear disco starting to properly settle in. Not kicking the door down just yet, but definitely in the building. Bright, rhythmic, glamorous, and wonderfully easy to like. A proper feel-good record. At 7, Billy Ocean with Love Really Hurts Without You, A terrific pop record. Catchy, lively, bright, and a reminder that Billy Ocean had that brilliant ability to sound both polished and warm at the same time. It's one of those records that doesn't just survive nostalgia. It earns it. At 6, Barry White with You See the Trouble with Me. And now, of course, the room temperature changes immediately. Because Barry White never really enters a chart, he arrives in it. That voice, that groove, that sense that he could probably seduce an entire street simply by clearing his throat. And this is exactly why a chart like this is so much fun. 1 minute, it's Bay City Rollers. The next, it's Barry White sounding like velvet furniture. At 5, Diana Ross with Theme from Mahogany, Do You Know Where You're Going To? And suddenly we're back in pure elegance. This is proper grown-up pop. Sophisticated, emotional, beautifully sung. And one of those songs that feels as if it belongs to candlelight, expensive curtains, and the possibility of dramatic eye contact. At 4, Hank Mazel with Jungle Rock, which is one of those gloriously odd chart entries that makes old charts so enjoyable. Because this is exactly the sort of record that, if it came out now, would either vanish in a weekend, or become a TikTok dance for people dressed as mechanics. Back then, though, it could simply turn up in the top 5 and nobody had to explain themselves. A simpler time. At 3, John Miles with Music. Now this is one of those records that people often forget was such a proper hit. But when you hear it, you remember immediately. It's dramatic. It's ambitious. It's unapologetically big. And it belongs to that great era when songs were still allowed to sound like they'd been written by people who had recently discovered both poetry and velvet jackets. And yes, it still stands up beautifully. And that brings us to the top 2. And what a contrast they are. At number 2, ABBA with Fernando. And this is where the chart suddenly gets a bit classier. Because whatever your view on ABBA, and frankly, if you don't like ABBA, I worry about you slightly. Fernando is one of those records that still sounds like an event. It's grand. It's melodic. It's wistful. It has that odd but wonderful feeling of sounding both intimate and huge at the same time. And let's be honest, if this had been number 1, nobody would have complained. And your number 1, in the UK, on 18 April 1976, was Brotherhood of Man with Save Your Kisses for Me. Now, whether you think it's charming, lightweight, catchy, cheesy, or all four at once, there is no denying it is one of those songs that instantly transports you somewhere. You hear it and suddenly you're back in flared trousers, family telly, lino flooring, and a time when Eurovision songs had absolutely no shame whatsoever. And honestly, good for them. Because the thing about Save Your Kisses for Me is that it knows exactly what it is. It isn't trying to be cool. It isn't trying to be edgy. It is simply trying to be remembered. And 50 years later, it still is. That's more than can be said for a great many serious records. Now what's striking about this chart overall is just how broad it is. In April 1976, you had a proper spread polished pop, lush soul, sing-along romance, glam leftovers, disco creeping in, and enough variety to keep everyone from your nan to your older brother relatively happy. It also reminds us just how much personality there used to be in the charts. Not just in the singers, but in the songs themselves. They had character, they had oddness, they had drama, and perhaps most importantly, they had no fear of being a bit daft from time to time, which, if I'm honest, is probably why I like them. So if you've enjoyed this little trip back to 18 April 1976, do let us know. If people like it, we'll happily do this again and revisit another month, another year, another chart, and another slice of musical history. And if you enjoy music nostalgia, chart rundowns, original songs, new music, and the occasional gloriously ridiculous surprise, do have a browse around the rest of the channel. Because where else, after all, are you likely to find ABBA, Barry White, Brotherhood of Man, and the Dung Beatles all living under the same roof? I've been Simon Jones. This has been 50 years ago this month, and I'll see you next time. Good night.